How y'all doing? It's good to be here with you all. The weather is nice. And today, I'm gonna teach you about grief. Yeah, I know. You came excited. We just sang about the living hope, and then all of a sudden, now I get to come up and talk about grief in all black. Pastor Ken called me this week, or a couple weeks ago, and he said, hey, I'm thinking about changing the schedule up. I think it'd be really, really good if you came out this weekend. I wasn't slotted to come out this weekend, but if you came out this weekend and talked about grief, and I was like, I think you should. And then he said, no, I think you should. And I was like, all right, you're a mentor of mine. I'll do what you said. And so I'm reminded of my son, who's a junior in high school, that came out of the womb in a cardigan with a pipe. But he asked me recently, Dad, how does the world work? And I was like, go ask your mom. How does the world work? And I started to really think about this. And you kind of just saw it in this kind of bumper video. Is when God created the world, he created it good. And then sin happened. And here's what sin really is. Sin is separation between you and God, you and your neighbor, you and creation, and you and yourself. So we separate from parts from ourself. Now what's wild about is it doesn't just stop there. Is that when there's separation with God, with self, with neighbors, with creation, then structures are going to be created. Mental structures, emotional structures, physical structures to separate me or us from them and ourselves. And then when you have structures that are based out of the separation that comes from sin, then you will have the creation of systems. And systems that are based out of sin most often will always lead to the suppression of others. This is just how the world works. And every one of us, we find ourselves living in a world where there are people who are making choices that are separated from God, separated from themselves, that are creating structures and systems. And for some of us, we've even tasted and seen what that kind of painful suppression can look like. But if that's how the world works, how does God work? And this is really, really important because as we dive into this conversation on grief, I need you to understand, one, every single one of us in this room has tasted grief. Every one of you in the communion gathering has tasted grief. Every one of you watching online, you have tasted grief. And here's the beautiful thing, is I actually think it's an invitation. Because if you think about this, how the world works, you have God creating it in good, and then there's sin, there's separation, then there's structures, and there's systems that lead to suppression. How does God work? Well, he creates the world that's good, and then there's sin. But instead of responding to sin with separation, how does God respond to sin? But with sacrifice. He actually sends his own son, who actually tastes the cross. And here is God who's actually experienced grief, watching his son, watching every single one of you. And God could have responded to the sin with separation. If anybody had that kind of a power and ability, being a holy God, he doesn't. He responds with sacrifice. And this is what the sacrifice does. We learn this in the book of Ephesians, is that it shatters all of the structures and the barriers that divide us from God, from ourselves, from our neighbors, from creation. And it doesn't just shatter. It's like you see God responding to sin with sacrifice that shatters, and then it is the start of a new community called the church. You and I. Choosing to live a different kind of life. And how does God work? Yes, he creates the world good, and then there's sin, but he doesn't respond with separation. He responds with sacrifice that shatters the structures, starts a new community filled with people like you and me, who are willing to sacrifice and serve others. And every single day we have a choice. Which way will we live? Will we go the way the world works, or will we join with how God's story works? And this is why it's important for us to know this right from the jump, because you have to ask yourself, well, when the world does what it does, or when life does what it does, how will I choose to respond? When pain shows up at your doorstep, when that medical report comes your way, when that relationship just seems to end, when that job that you loved just ends up ending. Whenever any of us go through some sense of grief and life does what it does, we will have a choice of how we choose to respond. Now, in 1965, Charles Schulz, who is the creator of the Peanuts comics, dropped this phrase that I had never heard before, many had never heard before, but here it is. This is Lucy saying, "Would you like to have a great big bug, Charlie Brown? I guess it would be all right. Here, yeah, good grief, Lucy. I thought you said hug." And that was the joke. Now, what's incredible is this phrase, good grief. It feels like an oxymoron, right? Like good grief. And I think deep down, for some of us, our understanding of grief has been something where we haven't wanted to actually ever deal with it. And we've just kind of been able to manage our grief. I remember loving this game as a kid, Jenga. And some of you, you've played this before. I did this once as a teaching prop, and it was a men's retreat, and I had two guys come up, and I had 45 minutes to teach an entire message on grief. And these two guys took 27 minutes to play the longest game of Jenga ever, but I couldn't cut it because I was in. I was like, what's gonna happen? But every single day when you think about this, is that we are just like stacking these moments of grief. The older we get, the more that we bump into beautiful and broken people, the more that we try to do life together, the more that we actually try to invest in someone's life, the more that we open ourselves up to both the beauty of love, but also the reality of grief and pain. And so what is grief? My working definition for grief is this: grief is learning to honor what comes up when change shows up. And all grief is a change. And you could have good grief. You literally can have good grief. Like when your child gets married and they come off the payroll. That's good grief, right? When your child decides to graduate high school and gets to choose a school and chooses not to go to Lubbock, but chooses to go, down to Texas A&M or to or the number one college football team in the country, the University of Texas. This is my favorite thing. I know some people never want to be hissed at. I love it. It is a term of endearment. I love the Texas A&M hiss. That is amazing. Nowhere else in the country is my favorite. Now, here's the thing, is good grief versus negligent grief. There's a difference. There's a good way to actually honor what comes up when change shows up, and then there's a negligent way, which is basically to suppress and manage. And I need you to understand this, because when you don't deal with your grief, it becomes a grievance. And it just starts to stack and stack and stack. And your heart gets more and more calloused. And you find yourself just not wanting to engage with anybody. And literally, like when you look at some people, you can just see how weathered and how they've never been able to actually honor the grief, honor the loss, honor the death, honor the pain, honor the wound. Now, what I want you to see is that Peter writes in 1 Peter chapter 5, writes an incredible understanding of how we can actually not just get through grief, but actually honor it and honor it well. Look what it says in 1 Peter 5:6. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. And I love, he just starts right here and he just says, hey, how you're actually gonna be able to handle difficult times, suffering, grief is it starts with you humbling yourself, recognizing you don't have all the answers, that there's someone actually greater than you. And you have to hold on to this incredible theological tenet is that God, and this is like a quote strictly back to the Hebrew scriptures, of God with his outstretched mighty arm will lift you up in due time. This is what God wants to do. And then after that, verse 7 says, then cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. And Peter's like a fisherman. And so he understands this idea of casting. And he said, man, what we get to do is we actually get to cast all of that pain, all of that trauma, all of the abuse, all of the neglect, all of the anxiety. We get to cast it towards the one who actually cares for you. And when you actually can humble yourselves and you actually can trust that God is actually going to lift you up in due time, and you trust that he's safe enough for you to cast all of that onto him, you speed up the healing. But here's what's powerful is for many of us, we've grown up in circles where maybe someone's just pulled a verse. And they've pulled the verse of humble yourselves that I just read, or cast your anxieties on him, the one who cares for you, or this next verse. And but when you put them all together, it's so powerful. Look what it says, verse 8. Be alert and sober-minded. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. So I know late at night, some of you have been like flipping the channels, and then all of a sudden it came to the National Geographic channel, and it's always a British man out in the safari. And it's almost like the same kind of tone of watching a putt on the 18th hole. And all of a sudden it's like, look at the lion. He sees that three-legged elk. That poor elk is going to meet its fate. And then you just watch this lion just go and just destroy it. And I think about this verse is that what we have when we don't have a place to cast our anxieties, when we don't have the actual perspective to humble ourselves and believe that God is going to lift us up, what we end up doing is we make ourselves so easy to be picked off by the enemy. And literally, this is just what the enemy is just going to keep doing. It's just going to keep trying to have things not go the way you want them to go. It's just going to start just taking some pieces, little by little. Yep, that was easy. And just all of a sudden, the whole thing falls. And then you're left trying to pick up these pieces. You're trying to why did this happen? Why did this relationship end? Why did all this stuff happen? And again, the more that you start to dig into that, the deeper it goes into all of this pain and grief that many of us have experienced, but never actually honored. This is why Peter says in verse 9, you got to resist him. You got to resist the enemy. You got to stand firm in the faith because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of sufferings. What's he saying? Is that every single one of us has tasted suffering. You are not alone, and the enemy will want you to believe you're the only one. You're the only one. You're the only one. But when you can actually understand that my role is to resist that kind of thinking, my role is when I experience that separation is not to create structures where I don't have to deal. It is for me to actually follow the way of God. And how did God do it? He responded to sin with sacrifice. And the sacrifice. And sometimes that sacrifice means we make a decision against ourselves. That's a little bit harder. To sit with that grief. To sit with that pain, to sit with that loss. And again, Peter reminds us when we actually do this, verse 10 and 11, it says, and the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered a little while, will himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast. The God of all grace is going to, after you've suffered a little while, restore you. Now, I remember when I was in third grade, I was playing baseball, and I was playing second base, and a grounder came at me, and I went down in textbook way to actually pick up and field the grounder, and it took a bad hop, and it hit me right in my face and broke my cheekbone. And I literally just dropped my mitt and walked straight to the car. Never really played baseball again. And I'll never forget, like, going to the hospital, they running x-rays on my face, and they're like, you broke your cheekbone. And I was like, well, what are you gonna do? And my dad's like, you should cast his whole face. They're like, you can't really do that. But what we're gonna do is just literally let it heal itself. And I was like, really? I'll never forget this doctor saying, he's like, what's pretty interesting is that when a bone breaks, the blood will like coagulate, and then all of a sudden, all of this calcium gets driven to the broken part of the bone. And yes, it'll be a little bit weaker as you have a cast on a broken arm for a bit, but as you grow, that area will actually be so strong where you broke it because of the calcium. And this is the way that God actually created us. He created us to heal from wounds, heal from pain, heal. And I love this because when you think about that verse, it's God's gonna restore us, this God of all grace. When we've suffered a little while, we're gonna be able to do this, but we're actually gonna be stronger, more firm, more steadfast in our faith. And the people who lean into their grief and experience healing from their grief are some of the most steadfast, firm, strong, faith-filled people I've ever been around. And I believe, can you imagine a church that actually lived like that? Be powerful. That's why Peter ends that section by saying, to him be the power forever and ever, amen. Almost like this prayer, to him be the power to do that again and again, over and over, ever and ever, amen. Now, I remember as I started to really try to learn about grief, I had a mentor of mine. A mentor of mine came up to me and said, hey, Steve, how's honoring the Spadura going? I was like, what? The Spadura? What do you mean? I was like, is that like a Hebrew word? Is that a Greek word? I'm like trying to go through my dictionary, and I was like, I've never heard that word before. And he said, no, it's an acronym. And for him, he kind of had made this word up based off the work of the 5 stages of grief from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And she had kind of created this as she was dealing and walking with people who were on their deathbed in hospice. And she had this framework. And many people thought it was linear, but deep down it was never meant to be linear. And what the Spadura was a way to check in with yourself, to kind of honor what comes up when change shows up and go, hey, where am I at in this process? The S was just the simple word shock. This is what happens, is when just the shock of loss or the shock of change or the shock of death or the shock of neglect or the shock of a loss of a job. And what often that shock does is it creates pain. It's pain. It's just like, that hurt. That's not fair. That's not right. And when you find yourself getting into that place, then typically we go to a posture of anger, which is just a mask of sadness. And find ourselves just mad. And when we sit with our anger long enough, for some of us, it's an easy way for us to experience just depressing thoughts. That'll never be better. I don't know a way through. I don't know how to do this without her or without him. I don't know a way forward. But as you walk that out and you honor the grief, the God of all grace, the God who will stretch out his mighty hand, will lift you up in due time, there will be a moment where there is this upward turn. And all of a sudden you have a little bit of hope. You have a little bit of belief that maybe tomorrow can be better. You have this little bit, it's starting to change. And as you start to have that upward turn, then all of a sudden the reconstruction. What will my life look like? What do I want it to look like? How do I actually reconstruct this in a way where Christ is at the center and I can walk through this life well? And when you go through the reconstruction, then there comes a moment of just acceptance. That's over. The relationship's over. I won't see them until I get to heaven. The family estrangement, the acceptance of that, I'm just going to be praying that God would change the hearts. and you find yourself really beginning to lean into this, is not neglecting it and being negligent with your grief. It's actually bringing it before the Father. I remember I was hiking and up in Arizona, I came to the top of Camelback Mountain, and I started to think, well, maybe grief, to look at it, maybe we ought to look at Holy Weekend. And Holy Weekend we have in Good Friday is the idea that when we are in grief, you didn't deserve it. It just shows up. It is the shock, it is the pain, it is the anger. And then Holy Weekend goes from Friday to Silent Saturday. And Silent Saturday is wild because for many scholars, they will talk about how the church, like these first believers, had no real idea that Jesus was going to resurrect. And so they're thinking to themselves, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And oftentimes, for many of us, in our anger or our depression or our upward turn, we find ourselves just trying to get through the grief as quick as possible. And sometimes we run to destructive patterns. And the enemy is just prowling around looking for us to devour, even in our pain, which just creates more pain. But you go from this moment of in grief to through grief, then you have the surprise of Easter Sunday. And Jesus resurrects. Death is defeated. And all of a sudden what you have in John 20 is Jesus returning, and Thomas comes up to him and says, hey, can I see the holes in your hand? And I love the fact that Jesus still had the scars and the holes. I say that because once you build the reconstruction and once you have this sense of acceptance, you will have gone through this grief journey, which is literally going from in grief to through grief and then now carrying it and being with the grief. It just won't be as heavy as it once was before. Can I ask you a question? What day of Holy Weekend are you currently in? Maybe for some of you feel like you're in Friday. Maybe for some of you feel like you're in Saturday. Maybe for some of you feel like you just tasted and received Sunday. And this is a drawing that I created from Grieve, Breathe, Receive. And this is the grief journey. And it's not linear, but grieve, the journey in grief. And that's where you're going to have the shock, the pain. That's going to be Friday, the anger. Breathe, that is the journey through grief. That is that kind of anger and depression and upward turn and your beginning, and then the receive, the reconstruction, the acceptance. But all of it, you can go from Sunday and then get on Twitter or look at an old Facebook post that reminds you of the relationship and go right to Friday. You can be in Saturday and go right back to Friday. You can be in Friday and jump to Sunday because God has just done something powerful with a friendship or some sense of opportunity. But it's not linear, but it's literally just being open to it. But I think for still some of us, we don't know necessarily how to do it. We don't know how to actually honor the spadura. We don't know how to actually make space for the grief. And I think for some of us, we remember when we were kids, right? You were skateboarding or riding your bike, you were rollerblading or roller skating, and you hit that one bump on the sidewalk where that one part of the sidewalk was a little bit higher and you just face planted. And you came into the house running and crying. And what was the first thing your parents said to you? Stop crying. And so you're like, oh, I can't grieve. So then all of a sudden, what do they do? One of the parents just comes and ends up grabbing the ugliest bottle ever of hydrogen peroxide. And the first time you experience hydrogen peroxide is traumatic because they just pour it on. And then your arm starts getting white and pussy and bubbly and you're like, I'm gonna die. And they're like, stop crying. And I'm like, I'm trying. And then what do? They kind of clean it up a little bit. And then they give you like a Paw Patrol Band-Aid. And you just have this Paw Patrol Band-Aid and they put it on. And this is like the way we do it. And it's really beautiful. And the way that the body works is the body is actually working even when we don't see it. The body is working to actually experience healing. Now, if you think about it this way though, if you had a wound and you came home and your mom was like, here's what we're gonna do. I went to Costco and I bought all the hydrogen peroxide. So we're just gonna stand here for the next 4 days and we're just gonna do a little drip campaign onto your arm. Not actually going to heal it well. There is a point, there is a process to where you clean this out, put a Band-Aid on it, but most people, after a day, they will look at the Band-Aid and they'll go, you know what, we should probably see how it's doing. And they try to pull the Band-Aid off, and that hurts. And then what do? They take the Band-Aid off, they add some peroxide, they put a new Band-Aid on. Most people who are healthy do this every day. Most guys do it every 4 days. But the idea is simply this. I'm not asking you to spend the next 4 months just trying to clean out all of the grief. But I also don't think that it's smart for us to go through life and pretend that we don't have grief. What I try to coach people through is going, what if you just gave yourself 15 minutes a week, 15 minutes a day, 15 minutes every other day, and all you literally were doing this was the visual. You were just opening up the Band-Aid, just exposing and sitting with the wound, and just pouring some peroxide on it, and then just saying, hey, I will come back to this in 2 more days. I'll come back to this in 3 more days. And little by little, just starting to sit with the pain, sit with the grief. And when you begin to do this, this is how God actually works. This is how God makes us stronger in our faith. This is how God responds. And what's so powerful is the more that we actually lean into God, the faster the healing actually happens. I have 2 questions for you. First question is this: how's honoring the Spadura going for you? Do you ever have moments where you just find yourself just going, man, that shock, that hit. Oh man, there's pain right now. And Lord, can you just sit with me in this? God, I'm really angry. It's not fair. It's not all right. And do you have a place to actually channel that anger? Because if you don't, it's going to go somewhere. And this is where the enemy, who's prowling around like a roaring lion, is looking to devour you. And for many of us, he does. Or maybe for some of you, it's in the depression. It's just the difficult thoughts. Or maybe for some of you, you start to have that upward turn and starting to actually create the reconstruction, the acceptance. This is going to be a different way forward. And I think as the church, most of us have experienced Sundays where it's always up and to the right. We're trying to have just moments of hope and joy. But often happens in the subconscious is that we've not actually given people the spiritual musculature to handle grief. And so when all of a sudden life does what it does, and the pieces have just fallen, then all of a sudden we find ourselves asking these questions like, where's God in all this? Does God actually see me? Does God know me? Does God care? We try to ask ourselves, why is suffering even happening? And suffering happens because of sin, right from the jump of Scripture. And that sin created separation from God, from ourselves, from our neighbor, from creation. And when that level of separation and structures and systems led to more suppression and more pain, this is why when we actually have experienced someone sinning against us, or when we have sinned against ourselves, against God, or against a neighbor, we have to get back to the way God works, which is responding with sacrifice, making a decision against what we want to do. See, I carry crosses all the time with me because it's so easy for me to forget. But Jesus was willing to endure this. God knows what you're going through. He watched his son die a death he didn't deserve. God watched his son get what we deserve. God watched his son. And sometimes I just have all of these questions when I get to heaven. Questions like, God, how did you do that? And I think for some of us, as we go through the suffering, or we go through the loss, or we go through the trauma, or we go through the pain, we're like, God, why? And yet God is just there watching and experiencing and grieving with us. Now, some of you know this. I lost my dad 5 years ago. And my dad had come down with leukemia. And it was difficult. He was in Grand Rapids at the LAC Center. They were amazing doctors. And but they did everything they could. And I'll never forget, a doctor came in and said, we can't help you anymore. You need to go to the University of Michigan. And so my dad moved to Ann Arbor, went into the University of Michigan, and they gave him a bone marrow transplant. There's one person in all of the world who was a perfect match, and she lived in Germany. And she was willing to go through a sacrifice to save my dad. It added 12 years to his life. And to this day, people always ask me, why do I love the University of Michigan so much? Because at any moment of any day, I could always talk to my dad about U of M football, and we could connect. And then I think about that woman in Germany who was willing to sacrifice for my dad to extend his life. And so I go back to Ann Arbor often, and I just walk. I walk by the hospital. I go to a game. Why? Because I want to stay so reminded of what my dad meant to me. I carry that grief with me, but I'm going to carry it differently. I'm going to carry it from a place of God's grace, God's outstretched arm, God's healing power, God's ability to restore. He's made me stronger, more firm, more steadfast. But it requires us to have to pick up our cross, to name what happened on our Friday, to walk out that process on Saturday, if we're ever going to taste and see the surprise of Sunday. And too many Christians can sing songs to God about how great God is and how he just stepped across this chasm, rescuing us, redeeming us, making us whole. And yet it's like we can sing it, but when we have to actually lean in with our own grief or our own sin or our own separation or our own structures or the systems that have led to suppression that we've been a part of, when we get to that point, we're like, no, I don't want to do that. And here's the truth. What ends up happening is we don't get as strong. We don't get as restored. We don't get as faith-filled. We don't get as firm and as steadfast. We don't get to taste and see the God of all grace. We don't get to experience God doing what God longs to do, is turning our Friday into a Sunday. And I have come to believe that grief, when honored well, not negligence, not just I'm not going to deal with it, but when it's honored well, you will experience the goodness of God in a way that no other time, no other experience could actually showcase. Because it's when you are at your lowest, you are at your worst, you are at the most filled with pain, the most sad, the most anger, the most shock, all of that, and God did not turn away from you. And all he asks is that we would turn towards him with our grief. Here's what I love to do, is I love to give a benediction over you all. But one of my favorite parts about Faith Bridge is that we're a church that believes about prayer, the power of prayer. It's not having to go through life alone. Maybe for some of you, You know what that grief is. You know that you are in a Friday moment. It's family estrangement. It's the loss of a job. It's finances out of control. It's addiction. Maybe for some of you, it's that silent Saturday and you're just walking through it and you're choosing some temptations and you feel like the enemy has just got you and you're just like, I'm stuck. Or maybe for some of you, you've tasted Sunday, but you have family members who are still stuck in Saturday and Friday. Don't rush out of this space without letting someone just see you and pray for you. It's one of the boldest things that you can do is actually say, I have grief and I don't want to carry it the way I've been carrying it. I want to honor what comes up, even when this kind of change showed up. Would you do this? Would you stand to your feet? Would you put out your hands just for a blessing? And when I'm done praying, the prayer team will be up front and they would love just to pray with you. I'll be up front. I'd love to pray with you. With your hands open, because it's a picture of grace. All we can do is receive it. We're really good at climbing ladders and taking, but when it comes to grace and healing, all we can do is receive. My brothers and sisters of Faith Bridge, I pray that this week you will honor the pain. You won't suppress it. You won't pretend that it's not there, but you'll just peel back that Band-Aid and allow the Spirit to clean it out. You will have a moment with the Lord where you will experience God, not just some thought in your head, but a tangible encounter of a God meeting you in your Friday and in your Saturday and allowing you in due time to experience what Sunday is all about. I hope you know how loved you are and how much God wants to heal you, even in your grief. Much love, grace and peace.